hear like a crack, and this thing fall down. It was a big bang inside. When you see that, I was sure that somebody died inside.
Montebour was taken to the hospital, and his injuries are believed to be non-life-threatening. Former Speaker of the State Assembly Sheldon Silver has been indicted on fraud charges by a federal grand jury in Manhattan. The 71-year-old was arrested last month. The indictment suggests little hope of a plea deal. While Silver resigned as Speaker, he continues to serve as a member of the Assembly. The man who plowed his car into a cab, killing a Brooklyn couple and their newborn son in 2013, was convicted of second-degree manslaughter yesterday. The man could face up to life in prison. The freezing temperature this morning put a huge strain on the city's infrastructure, including water mains and gas pipes. Public transit agencies reported delays due to ice buildup. But New York is not alone. Half the country was plunged into this deep freeze. But by Sunday, the temperature should warm to a balmy 40 degrees. I'm Ariana Skybell, and this is Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Hannah Klingberg.
And I'm Joe Sykes. A grand jury has indicted former New York Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver on corruption charges. He faces 5 counts involving bribery and kickback schemes that total roughly $4 million. The scandal's fueling discussion on accountability in government.
Silver's trial will start next Tuesday. I asked Blair Horner, director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, how the alleged scheme could have gone on for so long.
One of the indictments against the assemblyman, it alleges that he hid the money that he was making from one of the law firms. In fact, hid his involvement in the second law firm completely. And so the weaknesses in disclosure laws, the opaqueness of the budget process are a breeding ground for these kinds of controversies and, in some cases in the past, scandals.
What do you think should be done about this?
Well, I mean, when it comes down to public officials, I think New Yorkers have a question to ask themselves. Should our elected officials serve more than one master, and the master being the public? I mean, there's been this long string of scandals, corruptions, indictments, prison terms against elected officials who were essentially moonlighting and using their public office for private gain. In the Congress, you can't do that. The outside income they're allowed is quite limited and robustly disclosed. In New York, the sky's the limit on how much money lawmakers can make on the side, and that practice has to end if the public is going to have any confidence that lawmakers' decisions are driven primarily by the need to protect the public interest.
In terms of transparency on a state level, how do you think New York compares to other states?
Well, I mean, New York's disclosure requirements are ironically among the better ones in the country. There are lots of states that have basically nothing. The problem really, in addition to sort of weaknesses in disclosure requirements, is the, at least so far, near total absence of state regulation. You can have the best laws in the world if they're not enforced by a aggressive, independent watchdog. Laws don't matter. And I think that one of the big problems in Albany is the lack of independent ethics oversight. We really haven't had it in New York, and the current watchdog that exists is designed as a product of compromise and is, sort of the traditional, constructing a horse through committee, you end up with a camel. That's sort of what we ended up with here in Albany, is a quite limited ethics watchdog. And we think one of the components of reform must be a radical overhaul of the oversight of state ethics laws that would lead to an independent, aggressive enforcer of the law, which we don't have right now.
Do you think Silver's indictment will help to rebuild the fractured relationship between the public and the government?
Well, I think it hinges now on what happens. The governor has said he's going to advance a comprehensive package of ethics reforms. We've heard that song before. It's like the old Peanuts cartoon where Lucy holds the football and tells Charlie Brown this time she really will hold it, he can kick it. I think the only way that the process of healing the rupture between the public and their own elected officials can begin is if real, meaningful ethics reforms are enacted, and that combination would include, I believe, a serious restriction on outside income, better disclosure, and effective enforcement of those laws. And the absence of any of those components, I think, will lead to, the football being yanked away again.
Thank you very much for speaking to me today.
Sure, my pleasure.
Blair Horner is a public advocate for open government. Tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of the death of Malcolm X. He was a polarizing figure known for his leadership in the Black nationalist movement and the Nation of Islam. In Washington Heights, the neighborhood where Malcolm X was assassinated, one man worries that people are forgetting the radical leader's philosophy.
The society has changed to the point where we're not as empowered as we once were. A lot of people don't follow the ways that he was teaching.
Nearby, the Shabazz Centre will celebrate Malcolm X's legacy with a memorial tomorrow. I went there and sat down with the centre's director, Brian Epps, who talked us through the day Malcolm X died.
From all accounts, the room had a capacity for 600 people. There were a little over 400 people there that day. I like to tell people, as you can imagine, once shooting starts, there's utter chaos, right? And there was chairs knocked over all over the place. But again, from all accounts, there were 3 assassins who, walked from the back of the room to the front of the room and shot at him up to 25 times with, over 15 bullets hitting him.
He went on to discuss Malcolm X's legacy in 2015.
A legacy that really calls us to what I like to say, be progressive forward. The things that Malcolm X was saying were really ahead of his time when he was talking about defeating colonialism and ridding ourselves of the negative aspects of capitalism. He was somebody who was standing up for women at a time when most people weren't talking about that. I like to say his leaving the nation on charges of sexual harassment, and nobody was talking about that. Nobody's making stands for that at the time, but it's something that he did. It really revoked his male privilege. He's a father of 6 daughters, 6 women, and that's certainly part of his legacy in terms of, I think he would care about how those women are treated in the world today. So it's definitely a legacy that encompasses everything that social justice and human rights is involved with.
And this is a particularly fraught time right now. We've had Ferguson, we've had Eric Garner. We've got what many are calling a sort of new civil rights movement with Black Lives Matter. What do you think his influence on that movement is?
So Black Lives Matter is a movement that's very insistent about talking about if Black lives matter, then all lives matter, like all Black lives matter, right? So it's not just about Black men who are policed and surveilled. It's also about Black women. It's about trans folks who are being killed on the streets and not being talked about. And Malcolm X was really getting to those points that really, Black Lives Matter is definitely rhetorical in that way, and not necessarily an advocate for certain types of legislation, but he was really talking about the humanistic points that human lives matter, right? And that lives, regardless of citizenship and where they are in the world, should be treated with dignity. So I think, 50 years later, we're kind of just getting to a movement that's really calling into things that Malcolm X tried to put in place.
Do you think he would have approved of the movement?
I think what he was trying to do, he understood that he couldn't just speak to oppressed people. He had to speak to everybody, right? And in speaking to everybody, he was really trying to raise social consciousness of everybody. Because if we were going to have a movement, that changed and of change and that respected social justice and human rights, then everybody had to be on the same page about that. So he understood that he had to speak to all different audiences.
What does Malcolm X mean to you as a young Black man who campaigns against oppression?
To me, it's certainly they're tough shoes to fill because, like I said, Malcolm was talking about things that we're just now starting to really start to enact, right? So how difficult it is to think about things that aren't going to be important to people 50 years from now, right, or 100 years from now in terms of social justice and human rights. That's his legacy, not just to be aware or active about the issues that we're confronting now, but to really be thinking about what is important to humanity for the present and the future. That's his enduring legacy.
That was Brian Epps, the director of the Shabazz Centre.
With a Democratic mayor and a Democratic city council speaker, there's not a lot of disagreement in city politics, except when it comes to policing.
As the city hashes out the budget for the new fiscal year, the idea of hiring 1,000 new police officers has made its way back to the centre of a political divide. Nardos Mesmer reports.
City Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito presented her State of the City speech last week. She recognized the deaths of 2 NYPD police officers, Wenjian Liu and Rafael Ramos, in late December.
Their senseless murders left a gaping hole in the hearts of New York. They are part of the fabric of our city and essential to our success. So when someone commits a violent act against our police officers, it is an act against all of us.
She says the city council and the mayor agree that getting new bulletproof vests is a priority, but she says there's still a big piece missing when it comes to police safety.
We also understand that the NYPD needs a higher headcount to carry out more community policing. That is why this council fought for 1,000 new police officers last year, and why we will continue to do so this year.
A big price tag of more than $90 million a year for something the mayor did not include in his preliminary budget that he submitted last week. But he's willing to talk about it.
As you know, Commissioner Bratt and his team have just finished their re-engineering evaluation, and they've put forward an initial plan. We're having very serious discussions about that. We're obviously going to have discussions with the City Council as well. So that's not going to be ready until we get to the executive budget.
One person who studies policing is Maria Haberfeld. She teaches at John Jay College and has been studying policing for a long time. She says it's more about quality over quantity.
To me, it's always about what kind of police officers you have and not how many police officers you have.
She says the hires will help the NYPD since at 35,000, the NYPD has 5,000 fewer police officers from just last year. She says in recent years, the city has broadened its hiring practices to include people with misdemeanors, and that should stop.
I would like to see advocating for raising the standards, like, educational standards, age standards, background standards.
Michael Palladino is the president of the Detective Endowment Association. He says he is frustrated when it comes to something as significant as hiring police officers and police safety. He says it's politics as usual.
Politicians seem to want to gain political capital on the backs of police officers. There's a lot of things going on in Albany. There's a lot of things going on in the city council that have turned off quite a bit of educated young men and women, and they've steered away from law enforcement.
Whether potential hires can be lured back will be determined by the final city budget in April. Nardos Mesmer, Columbia Radio News.
Apple CEO Tim Cook caused a stir a couple of weeks ago when he announced that the company is investing $850 million in an enormous solar energy installation. It's the largest renewable energy deal in history.
And it's the latest one in a recent wave of major investments in green energy. A report by accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers, released last month, shows venture investment in clean technology increased by nearly 40% last year. And the boom has reached the East Coast. Alistair Gardiner reports.
New York City's first industrial wind turbine sits right on the water's edge in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, at a company called Sims Municipal Recycling. In the heart of the plant, conveyor belts ferry and sort various recyclables. A green sticker on several pipes in the room reads solar. They carry solar energy from panels on the roof directly to the machinery. The company's education coordinator, Aideen Quinn, says that the company just installed the wind turbine, and the plant got a lot of attention just over a year ago for their solar installation.
The day that we opened here, it was the biggest in the city.
That's despite the fact that the solar panels and turbine only generate about 20% of the company's energy use. She says that within a few years, though, both the solar panels and the wind turbine will have paid for themselves. But the firm had an additional incentive.
Definitely the business choice is the one that makes it happen. But the original idea was certainly, we're a recycling company, we need to be doing this type of stuff.
There aren't many other businesses in New York City making investments like this, much less Apple's. Stephen Kine is the Associate Director of ACRE, the Accelerator for Clean Tech and Resilient Economies. He says there's a reason for that.
It's no surprise that you can't really put, a wind farm or solar panels on the rooftop because the rooftops are impermeable, so you can't really place anything. So there's a lot of difficulty that existed in New York City.
ACRE opened in 2009 as the first incubator for clean tech in the city, and the NYU affiliate is still the largest. The 13 companies being housed by ACRE are not solar or wind companies. They're working on technologies that aren't so straightforward.
So we have a company called Hevo Power that's creating a solution for commercial vehicles to be entirely electric powered, and they would charge through wireless charging while they're in a dock and dormant.
Other companies are working on small ideas that will have a huge impact. One is developing a smartphone-operated blanket for radiators that allows tenants to control when heat comes out and how much. That could help save some of the $2 billion that their research says building owners throw away because they can't control individual radiators. Kyan says that could be a big deal in New York City.
The million buildings in New York City use 94% of all the electricity in New York City. And that's where the markets are. It's not going out and selling to GE or selling to these big corporations on how to put together wind farms. It's those small wins about going to buildings and saying, hey, this is some things you can do to immediately impact your bottom line and you'll be saving the environment.
Kyan says deals like Apple's won't save the clean tech industry.
It's going to be a small $5-10 million investments. It's going to be each one of these buildings one by one becoming more energy efficient and implementing these technologies that will eventually, as a whole in the long term, have undoubtedly a bigger impact than the $850 million that Apple spent.
Aideen Quinn says that Sims Municipal could be in the market for technology like this.
We're always looking for, how to be on the progressive edge of using alternative energy and also saving money.
The future will be bright for companies if they experience the same kind of widespread adoption that solar has in the city. In 2005, there were only 45 installations. Now there are around 2,600. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Alistair Gardner.
Now we hear about weather on the sun.
It's got to be hotter than New York, right?
Yes, it is. It's also windy, and that can be a problem. Solar winds are incredibly powerful bursts of high-energy particles, and when they explode toward Earth, they can do major damage to electronic systems, especially if there's no advanced warning.
To deal with the problem, a new satellite is heading into space. Miriam Sitz has the story.
T-minus 10, 9, 8.
The Discover satellite is just 4.5 by 6 feet in size, human scale. But it's got a big job.
1, 0. And liftoff. Everything has gone just as planned. The Deep Space Climate Observatory is free to discover, on its way to the L1 Lagrange point, where it will send data back to help protect those of us on planet Earth.
The satellite launched last week from Cape Canaveral, and in 100 days it'll reach its destination, a point in space 1 million miles away from Earth called L1. Tom Berger is the director of the Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado. His office is part of the Discover mission team.
Yeah, the L1 point, L in that case stands for Lagrangian, so this is what we call the Lagrangian point. There are several of them, and they are gravitational balance points, if you will, between the Earth and the Sun.
Basically, if you put a satellite in a Lagrangian point, it'll stay there on its own, constantly facing the sun while keeping its back to the sunlit side of the Earth. From that position, Discover can detect solar winds. They're called coronal mass ejections.
Millions of tons of magnetic plasma heading out at 1 million miles an hour, typically.
If solar plasma is shooting out into space, no problem. But sometimes one of these ejections is pointed toward us.
If that's coming towards the Earth, the interaction of that magnetic cloud with the Earth's magnetic field will trigger a large geomagnetic storm.
Such a storm can disturb telecommunications, GPS, airplanes, power grids, all sorts of electrical systems. So that's why the satellite's headed to L1, to detect the storm before it reaches Earth. There's a very old NASA satellite at L1 already. It's called ACE. Discover is essentially the upgraded model, with some new features that's going to replace it.
I like to think of the ACE and Discover satellites out there at L1 as kind of our tsunami buoys in the ocean of space.
Discover will transmit data back to Berger and his colleagues about the size, speed, and intensity of the impending shockwave. And soon, they'll even be able to determine where on the planet a solar ejection will hit. That's a new, and potentially extremely valuable feature. Discover's data will give between 15 minutes and an hour of advance notice. That's enough time for a pilot to drop her plane in altitude to avoid the magnetic storm, or for power grid operators to reroute or even shut off parts of the grid to prevent outages and damage. In 1989, before the advanced warning system was in place, a massive geomagnetic storm caused a 9-hour blackout in Quebec. John Kappenman is an expert on these storms.
They went from normal operating conditions to complete province-wide blackout in about 92 seconds.
And that's not even a worst-case scenario.
The largest ones could be, in fact, nearly 10 times more intense than the March 1989 storm.
It's not only industry folks who can monitor geomagnetic storm data. It's all available online at spaceweather.gov. Berger, the director for the Space Weather Prediction Center, encourages teachers to use Discover data with students.
An interesting classroom activity might be to keep track of these watches, warnings, and alerts, and when there is an incoming geomagnetic storm, to have the class use their cell phones to measure the magnetic field.
Of course, there's an app for that, CrowdMag.
And watch the storm hit and see how good the forecast was, for instance.
Discover will start transmitting data by August, just in time for the new school year. Miriam Sitz, Columbia Radio News.
Back on Earth, jeans were on President Obama's mind at this year's State of the Union.
And he wasn't thinking about fashion. He asked Congress to put $215 million towards using genetics to personalize medical treatment. And he said the way to do it is to build a giant database using genomes from 1 million volunteers.
So the Precision Medicine Initiative we're launching today will lay the foundation for a new generation of life-saving discoveries.
But these discoveries might take some time. Ariana Skybel takes us deep into genome jumble.
Our genomes are complicated, but genetic testing is helping us make sense of it all.
For a long time, we knew that we had hereditary materials, but all we could see were the chromosomes.
Arthur Kaplan is the head of medical ethics at NYU.
That would be like seeing an encyclopedia and being able to see the volumes of the encyclopedia.
Being able to see these volumes, or chromosomes, doesn't tell us enough to create the individualized care that Obama wants to see. But now that we can sequence genes, things are starting to change.
Sequencing your genes is opening up one of the volumes and being able to see the sentences.
Seeing these sentences of genetic material, Kaplan says, is just the beginning.
Just getting the genetic message doesn't mean you're fully going to understand how to safely intervene to fix something or prevent something. It's certainly the start of a road, but it's a road, and it's a pretty long road.
The road is long because there's so much genetic material to interpret in the general population. And until we develop a dictionary to understand that material, we won't be able to create targeted cures for diseases. But it's actually possible to know a lot more about the genetics of more insular communities. In fact, the Ashkenazi Jewish genome is already completely mapped. But having such a small genetic community makes members more likely to pass on certain diseases. Chani Weissman, a genetic counselor, took precautions before starting her family.
I did carrier screening before I even met my husband because I was already a genetic counselor, and I said, I should do carrier screening because I'll need it at some point.
Ashkenazi Jews are more likely than the general population to be carriers of certain genetic diseases. For example, 1 in about 30 Ashkenazi Jews carry the Tay-Sachs gene. Children with Tay-Sachs have a whole host of physical and mental issues and tend not to live past 5 years old. Genetic testing has become a pretty standard practice. In Atlanta, a Jewish group called Chai-Tunes urged folks to get tested with a song.
My new wife is a Persian Jew. Genetic testing, it's great for family planning.
Of course, genetic testing isn't just for family planning. It can also be used to prevent disease. About a year ago, Angelina Jolie discovered she had a faulty gene associated with breast cancer. This gene is called BRCA. As a result, she had a preemptive double mastectomy. In the weeks following Jolie's announcement, women of all ethnicities flocked to genetic counselors to get tested. After this, the Program for Jewish Genetic Health at Albert Einstein College started providing subsidized BRCA testing for Ashkenazi Jews, who have a 1 in 40 chance of being carriers. Traditionally, only women with a history of breast cancer would request testing. Nicole Schreiber-Agus, the director of the Jewish Genetic Health Program, said after Jolie, this pattern changed.
But we're also getting people who are just coming in because they know they're Ashkenazi Jewish, they know that there's this 1 in 40 carrier rate, and they just want to know.
And today, people can afford this knowledge. A decade ago, it cost about $1 billion to sequence a genome. Today, it costs closer to $5,000, and the price continues to drop. To test one gene can be as cheap as $100. But Kaplan, the bioethicist, says that as genetic testing becomes more common, ethics become a necessary conversation.
There are just billions of ethical issues that come out of this genetic revolution.
So we looked at a few key ones, like insurance.
Health insurance, life insurance, these are keyed up to risks. The more we find out about our genetic makeup, the more hard it could be for some people to get life insurance or disability insurance.
And while it's great to find out things about your own genome, what if you don't want other people to know?
Are people going to say, hey, before we go on a date or before we sign a marriage license, how about we all go out and get genetically tested before I find out if I want to breed with you?
While genetic testing is not on most couples' wedding to-do list today, perhaps soon it'll be right up there with the invitations, floral arrangements, and seating charts. Ariana Skybell, Columbia Radio News.
The nation's governors will gather in Washington this weekend for a 3-day winter meeting. For presidential hopefuls, it's a chance to be seen on the national stage.
With less than a year to the Iowa caucuses, the GOP might be the party to break a recent presidential pattern. Tyler Daniels reports that some candidates are challenging a recent trend of presidents with Ivy League backgrounds.
Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and George H.W. Bush all have degrees from Harvard or Yale. George W. Bush has degrees from both. 2012 presidential opponent Mitt Romney has 2 degrees from Harvard. The 2016 GOP field could change this pattern if the conventional Washington wisdom that Chuck Todd cited on last Sunday's Meet the Press holds.
There's no one front runner, but I think we know what the top tier is. And the top tier right now is Bush and Walker.
Former Florida Governor Jeb Bush graduated from the University of Texas, but Governor Scott Walker didn't graduate at all. He enrolled in Marquette University, but he dropped out just before he ran for state assembly. If Walker wins the Republican nomination, he'll be the first major party candidate without a college degree since Barry Goldwater in 1964. If he becomes president, he'll be the first without a degree since Harry Truman. New York Times columnist Frank Bruni doesn't think any of that is necessarily a problem.
I don't think you have to necessarily go to a good school or even graduate to become president.
Bruni has a book coming out next month. It's called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, and it makes the case you don't need to go to an elite school to be a success.
If you look at vice presidents and people who've had the nomination and you diversify the sample pool, or rather you enlarge it, you find plenty of people who do not have fancy degrees.
Most Americans don't care if their president went to a fancy school, according to Drew DeSilver from the Pew Research Center, which polled Americans last year.
74% of Americans said it didn't matter at all if they'd gone to a prestigious, if their candidate had gone to a prestigious university, whether it would make them more or less likely to support them.
Only 19% of Americans said they'd be more likely to support a candidate who attended a prestigious university. Frank Bruni thinks the fact that the last 4 U.S. presidents went to elite schools is a bit of a coincidence.
I think that has a lot less to do with Americans saying, I want a guy from Harvard or I want a guy from Yale, than it has to do with some of the advantages of networking.
The first people many political candidates turn to for contributions are their classmates from college or grad school. It's not an elite degree that makes you president, but it might be a presidential personality that gets you an elite degree. Tyler Daniels, Columbia Radio News.
You're not alone if you felt out of place in a foreign culture. Well, it's possible to feel that way in your own culture sometimes. Commentator Anjali Shastri describes her lifelong struggle to connect with her family's Hindu heritage.
I grew up in a small suburb just outside the San Francisco Bay Area. There weren't too many Indian families in our town, but my mom always wanted me and my brother to be more Indian. My mom is a devout Hindu. She would wake us up on holidays like Diwali, the ancient Indian festival of lights, with a greeting, and then we would recite prayers in our coat closet turned prayer room filled with pictures of Hindu gods. These prayers are called shlokas, and they are in Sanskrit. Om Gananam Tvam Ganapati Gum Hava Mahe. I struggled to wrap my tongue around these complicated words. But I do remember seeing the joy on my mom's face as my brother and I finally mastered these shlokas. Another challenge? The sari. I was expected to wear it during our celebrations, but I didn't know how to tie the yards of sari fabric around my body without my mom's help. When I went off to college, my mom gave me a picture of the Hindu elephant god Ganesh to put up in my dorm room so he could watch over me. I think that picture ended up in a drawer somewhere. But try as I might, I couldn't shake these childhood memories. They're what ultimately got me to attend Colombia's Diwali celebration this past November. I donned a blue and gold sari number to match with the other South Asians in traditional dress. My roommate from India helps me tie it, but the heavy fabric was in danger of slipping out of place. As I walked into the event, I saw girls spinning to the sound of traditional Indian music. Miniature lights were set around the room to commemorate Diwali. Members of the Indian Multicultural Association were chanting prayers. They described the significance of Diwali before it was time for the most important part, the food. The line for the buffet stretched out the door. My mouth watered. So, I can't cook Indian food to save my life. But as I looked at the dishes served up, they reminded me of my grandmother and mom's cooking styles. There's Navratan Korma, a fiery curry of peas and carrots, and Palak Paneer, a blend of forest green spinach and cheese tofu. I'm full to the brim and satisfied. I wandered around to watch female students waiting for green henna designs to dry on their hands. Others have put on bindis, the colorful red dots that Indian women wear between their brows to signify marriage. These days, Indian girls wear them as decoration. It's amazing to me that these girls are embracing Indian culture in a way that I have not. I called my mom after the event to let her know I went to celebrate Diwali. There's happiness in her voice, but that doesn't stop her from guilt-tripping me. "Why didn't you do that kind of stuff back home?" she said. It's not like Indian culture is that different from other cultures. Parents impart traditions to their children, who are then expected to pass them on to their own children. I can still repeat my shlokas and tell you the significance of each Hindu god. I may never stop questioning my religion and heritage, or whether I believe in God, but if I can make my mom even the tiniest bit proud by attempting to embrace our heritage, I'll take it.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Hannah Klingberg.
And I'm Joe Sykes. Uptown Radio is online at uptownradio.org.
Coming up, a proposed exemption from the city's Vision Zero plan might help bus drivers avoid arrest.
We'll hear from composers who are making music from data. A city task force is helping tenants go after bad landlords.
Then we'll head downtown to Manhattan's courthouse for a terrorism case. And finally, we'll meet some of the colorful fans of My Little Pony.
But first, this news.
From Columbia Radio News, I'm Tyler Daniels. Austria's finance minister announced today that the Eurozone would agree to a 4-month extension on the Greek bailout, provided that Athens complies with certain reforms. The 4-month extension is lighter than the 6-month extension the Greek government requested. Wall Street reacted positively to the news. The S&P 500 hit an all-time high today. The S&P closed up 0.61% at 2110, and the Dow closed up 154 points at 18140. The Obama administration announced today that 800,000 customers of healthcare.gov received incorrect tax information from the government. Miriam Sitz reports on the implications for consumers.
Officials are asking those affected by the error to wait before filing their taxes until they've received the corrected forms. As for the 50,000 or so who have already filed, they'll get special instructions from the Treasury Department about how to resubmit. The root cause of the problem is unknown, say officials. Some people receive too much assistance with premiums and others too little. At today's daily White House briefing, Press Secretary Josh Earnest defended the merits of the system, despite this setback.
I think this is an opportunity for us to talk about the fact that there are millions of people all across the country who can go to a marketplace, who can shop for health care, and they can actually get a tax credit from the federal government to make that health care more affordable.
Officials also announced today a one-time enrollment grace period. Uninsured people facing a fine will be able to sign up for coverage through healthcare.gov between March 15th and April 30th. Miriam Sitz, Columbia Radio News.
The U.S. Department of Transportation announced today that it would fine Takata, a Japanese auto parts company, $14,000 a day for not cooperating with a federal investigation regarding defective airbags. A French digital security company, Gemalto, announced this afternoon that it would investigate whether or not U.S. and British spy agencies hacked encryption codes from the company. These claims were reported yesterday as revelations from whistleblower Edward Snowden's leaked documents from the NSA. A British government spokesperson declined to comment on the specifics of the allegations, but stated they abide by, quote, strict and legal policy framework. The former First Lady of Virginia, Maureen McDonald, was sentenced to prison today for 1 year and 1 day. This follows her husband's sentence of 2 years in prison last month. Governor Andrew Cuomo announced today that the date of the special election to replace Staten Island Congressman Michael Grimm will be May 5th. Last month, Congressman Grimm resigned after pleading guilty to tax evasion. The company Walmart announced yesterday that it would raise the wages of 500,000 of its employees in the next coming months. You can expect delays on the subways this afternoon due to cold weather. It's 19 degrees right now in Harlem. Clear skies, going down to 9 tonight. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Tyler Daniels.
A Williamsburg bus driver hit and seriously injured a girl crossing a city street last Friday. He was arrested for failing to yield. The charges are new. They're part of the city's Vision Zero plan for pedestrian safety.
Some bus drivers are outraged that criminal charges could put their livelihoods at risk. But Anjali Sastry reports that the city council is considering an amendment that could keep bus drivers from being arrested.
It's a freezing Friday morning at the M60 bus stop on 106th Street and Broadway. The M60 bus runs from Broadway toward LaGuardia Airport. It's just another day for Jeremy Johnson. He's been a bus driver for 22 years. What kind of bus driver is Johnson?
A safe one.
Johnson is one of many bus drivers who say they feel threatened by Mayor Bill de Blasio's Vision Zero safety plan. The plan is trying to increase pedestrian safety citywide. But transit union officials and bus drivers feel a right-of-way law in the plan attacks bus drivers. The law went into effect in August and holds all drivers who don't yield and then injure or kill a pedestrian accountable.
We've been, the victims of a plan that the de Blasio has put in place.
Advocates of Vision Zero feel differently.
Well, the right-of-way law that's being applied is an important protection for pedestrians and cyclists.
That's Ollie Oliver. He's a field organizing coordinator for Transportation Alternatives, a city group that advocates for safer streets. He says the new law is for all drivers, not just bus drivers.
Weakening the right-of-way law would not be a step forward for protecting vulnerable road users. They're not overly harsh.
Bus drivers are up in arms after a fellow bus driver was arrested for hitting a 15-year-old girl last week in Williamsburg. In December, another bus driver was arrested when he struck and killed a 78-year-old man in East Flatbush. Ed Lavelle lives at 96th Street and West End Avenue, another intersection where pedestrians have been killed.
It feels dangerous walking around here. I have 2 young children, so I'm very worried.
But Lavelle thinks all drivers in the area are aggressive, not just bus drivers.
The bus drivers are not the biggest part of the problem.
A wide stretch of Broadway between Columbus Circle and 125th Street is considered a major crash corridor by the Vision Zero plan, and the city has proposed better traffic lights and speed limit radars for the area. Johnson, who drives up Broadway every day, isn't saying it's okay to hit people, but he doesn't think bus drivers should be arrested for accidents.
We as humans, sometimes we do make mistakes. We don't come to work to hurt people. When you feel that you could be arrested for something, it's kind of stressful.
New York City Council will consider a proposed amendment next month that could exclude bus drivers from the right-of-way law. Anjali Sastry, Columbia Radio News.
We're living in the age of big data. We now know exactly how many times the average person blinks per year, how many steps we've taken in a day, and how long it takes us to get from point A to point B.
With our culture becoming increasingly quantified, a number of artists are turning data into music. Brian Fu is one of these composers. His latest piece, a music video, uses data on neighborhood median income in New York City. Dasha Lisitsina takes us on a musical journey on the subway.
That's the sound of the 2 train, or rather Brian Fu's version. The journey starts off pretty quietly in Flatbush Avenue, Brooklyn. Median income per year, $37,000. Fu's piece comes with visuals that chart the subway stops. We're now on the edge of Brooklyn. Hoyt Street, Borough Hall. We're crossing into Manhattan. We've hit Wall Street. Median income, about $125,000. The music is loud and cacophonous throughout much of Manhattan. Fu took sound samples from the subway and bits and pieces from New York musicians, 63 sounds in total.
And then for each instrument, I gave it like a value, like a price, essentially. And then basically what the algorithm does, it goes through each station and assigns each station a budget based on the median income of the area. And then with that budget, it can buy as many instruments as it can afford in the order of soft to loud.
So by the time we hit Chambers Street, median income $200,000, the climax of the piece, it sounds like this. Harlem, 135th Street, sounds like this. Manhattan, the financial capital of the world, is also the place with the greatest income inequality in America.
It's something you see all the time, like on the subway, in terms of, if you take the subway like through different boroughs, you can kind of tell when somebody's going to get off a certain stop.
Fu says making music of this data has an emotional impact.
Put it this way, like a chart never made me feel like I was going to cry, or kind of produce like a chill through my body, whereas music does that, or you can do that.
Music is very, very good at political impact.
That's Luc Dubois, another artist who uses data. He says he usually despises drab journalistic data visualization, but visual art made from data, good. Music, even better.
It's easier to emotionally manipulate someone with music than with a painting. You fall in love to songs, you don't fall in love to a set of pastoral prints on your wall, right?
Through his own work, Dubois aims to close the gap between the hard, cold data and the lives behind it.
What I do is I try to look at mine's about finding a good metaphor to really drive home that the data is not abstract, that it actually represents people. I call it hard data.
That's heart as in I Heart NY.
Right, so it's data that's factual, that can hurt.
In a way, it's not really surprising artists are taking inspiration from what's happening in our culture. We're now obsessed with quantifying everything, even ourselves. But data, the measured recording of the observed world, predates computers and has been part of music since the beginning.
The thing that is new, right, is the idea of I'm gonna take, the US Census and I'm gonna turn it into sound, right, which is mapping or transcoding. That's kind of unusual. That's sort of new.
We're now in the Bronx. Here, the music dies down again. Dasha Lisitsina, Columbia Radio News.
Us Londoners often complain about the weather. New Yorkers, however, gripe about your rent and your landlords.
And now the city is going to help you do something about it. Mayor de Blasio just announced a new task force to support tenants who want to press criminal charges against their landlords. Adelie Ponte decided to find out exactly what this means to New Yorkers.
Low and moderate income New Yorkers are more likely to be harassed by their landlords because they are also more likely to live in rent-stabilized apartments. Ellen Davidson of the Legal Aid Society says that landlords have an incentive to push tenants out of those apartments. She says remedy-wide complaints
We're
are
sorry,
rising.
we're currently
more than
experiencing a technical issue. We'll be right back.
Low and moderate income New Yorkers are more likely to be harassed by their landlords because they're also more likely to live in rent-stabilized apartments. Ellen Davidson of the Legal Aid Society says that landlords have an incentive to push tenants out of those apartments.
We'll have that piece for you later. We still have some technical difficulties.
She says remedy-wide complaints are rising. They've more than doubled since 2011.
A jury in New York will decide if the Palestinian Authority is liable for acts of violence committed more than a decade ago in Israel. American victims and their families are suing for close to $1 billion.
The case is one of several in which Middle East conflicts are being played out in U.S. courts. Chava Gurari reports.
In 2002, New Yorker Mark Sokolow was shoe shopping with his wife and 12-year-old daughter on Jaffa Street in Jerusalem. They suddenly heard a blast. Wafa Idris, a 28-year-old Palestinian from Ramallah, detonated a suicide bomb she was carrying in a backpack, killing one other person and injuring over 100. Sokolow is the lead plaintiff in the case that is being tried in the federal court in Manhattan. The rest of the plaintiffs, about 30 in all, have similar stories about ordinary lives changed in an instant. At the heart of the court case is whether these acts of violence were committed by individuals acting of their own volition or part of a policy sanctioned by the Palestinian government. It isn't disputed that the Palestinian Authority makes payments to families of prisoners in Israeli prisons. The plaintiffs' lawyers call these martyr payments and say they prove that the Palestinian Authority actively encourages terror. The defendants' lawyers say the payments are part of a social welfare program and not related specifically to acts of violence against Israelis. In his closing arguments, Mark Rochan, the lawyer for the Palestinian Authority, said, "Nobody killed themselves so their family will get paid 600 shekel a month. Nobody." Tolchin, a lawyer for the plaintiffs, says the case sends a message to the sponsors of terrorism internationally.
You have an organization here that is very much funded by countries around the world. And countries around the world give the Palestinian Authority money thinking that they're funding nation building. And if the Palestinian Authority goes and, instead of nation building, conducts terrorism, and as a result for the country, the money
into next
In the world of subdeveloped
are more likely to be harassed took the tenants to buy them out.
and a shout